Welcome to Ball State Today. I'm your host, Jim Nickerson. There's been going to be a greater accountability on the part of society as a whole, and not just on the part of educators, for the education of our children, according to H. Dean Evans, newly appointed Superintendent of Public Instruction. Evans, our guest on today's program, addressed Ball State educators and students this week and had these comments.
Dr. Evans, on July 1st, the state adopted a requirement that teachers must pass a competency test before receiving licenses. Tell us a bit about the requirement and how it will affect education in Indiana. What are its advantages and disadvantages?
The requirement is that the teacher must take a written test. It's an objective test as well as a test in writing composition skills. The requirement, of course, is for the purpose of identifying those people who do not have the necessary language arts skills especially, but also other skills, math and other academic skills, to become models of young people in the classroom. The requirement is that if you don't pass the test and there's a precise cutoff score that's been determined, then you are allowed to continue taking the test until such time you are in a position to pass it. I think the reason for giving that test, of course, is to make sure that we are in fact a profession, to be certain that the people who enter our profession have the basic competencies to handle the classroom work.
So those who don't pass the test then can take additional schooling and continue to take the test.
Or they can do self-study and also retake the test.
Mm-hmm. How will teacher competency testing affect the number of minority students going into teacher education? And is there a shortage of minority students who plan to be teachers?
I don't think the test necessarily should influence in a negative way at all minority students entering the profession, especially if the test is constructed fairly, and hopefully it is. I don't believe we're going to find that it places an undue hardship on any one segment of our population. There is a shortage, certainly, of minority teachers. I think we need to identify what causes minorities to not come into our profession. How do we identify that? I think we go to the minorities and find out from them, the people who are in college, for example, why did you select one profession or one occupational pursuit over the education profession? And then we have to respond to that. We have to make sure that the profession is attractive enough to be certain that our minority population is going into teaching. It's exceedingly important that we have a heterogeneous clientele of teachers, and we have to work very hard at making that possible.
Getting back to testing just a moment, the most responsive chord that you touched with the overflow capacity audience you had tonight here at Ball State Teachers College was that of testing. And yes, you mentioned that your office and the office that you now hold has received tests previously, receiving results of tests now and will in the future that are never looked at and the results never compiled. And you suggested a change in testing that received a great response of applause.
That's right. We have a hodgepodge of testing being required in the state of Indiana right now. It's costly. Quite frankly, it doesn't lead in any positive direction, in my opinion. We have some tests that, of course, are very important and necessary and beneficial. We have competency tests in grades 3. They will become necessary in grades 3 and 6 next year, and the following year in grades 3, 6, and 8. We also have tests of Chapter 1, which is for disadvantaged children. We have tests which are called CAPS tests, which are required by the state of Indiana. The materials are sent to our office, and it's been my observation that nothing has been done with the CAP test results. We also have, in most school systems in Indiana, if not all of them, standardized tests that are being given. I'm suggesting that we do away with all of that testing and develop a standardized test, nationally normed, criterion referenced, for grades kindergarten through the 12th grade. We identify, as we're working on right now, what are the minimum requirements or the basic requirements for kindergarten, for first grade, for second grade, for 11th grade U.S. history, etc. What do we expect young people to learn in each of those grades and each of those subjects? Then we identify a bank of test questions for every grade level and every subject that is appropriate for the given subject. Now, then we go to the national test manufacturers. They have thousands of tests that are nationally, test questions that are nationally normed. We then contract on a statewide basis with one of those test manufacturers, and we select the test items appropriate to our instructional program in the state of Indiana. We give that same test to all the students in Indiana. Then the local school corporation can utilize the test results in their own way. The state of Indiana can make comparisons with students from other states in the nation, and we in fact can be held more accountable for what it is we're trying to teach and what we're accomplishing in our schools. I'm inclined to feel that public education has not been willing to be as accountable as we should be. And when we look at the automobile occupation, for example, the industry, the automobile industry, they didn't allow themselves to be accountable to the public as they should have been. And as a result of that, we no longer are the leaders, obviously, in that industry. Let's not cause our public education to lack accountability, for the public to turn against us even more than they have right now. Let's develop an accountable system where the public will know whether or not they are spending their money wisely, and we give them the proper answers.
Is this the testing norm subscribed to by other states? Is, in effect, Indiana out of step?
I think the trend may be that direction, but I think the general practice is what we've been doing in the past.
You talked about a new philosophy also.
Yes. I think what I'm looking at for the Department of Education is to not throw away, our only task is to not just discard the undesirable practices that have been going on in the Department of Education. We'll never get ourselves pulled up and become leaders in education in the country by just getting rid of undesirable practices. I believe that we have to develop a new mission, a new philosophy, a new purpose for education in the state of Indiana. And we're going to have a reordering or a restructuring of the Department of Education. I'm hoping to announce that sometime before the middle of October, which I believe will cause public education, through the direction of the Department of Education, to move forward in a very, very positive way.
Can you give us any hint as to what that restructuring might be?
We're going to, I think, restructure the department around various functions. Currently, we have some 20-plus divisions that the Department of Education is based upon. It requires a lot of people. It requires some services to public schools that we're not providing in a clear-cut fashion. I hope that we will do more brokering of services instead of providing services directly by our department. I also hope that we will be futuristic-minded, to the point that we will identify those programs that are working, the reasons they're working, what minor tune-up requirements might be there in order to cause them to work better, and then go about the business of improving what it is we're doing. At the same time, identify programs that should be implemented in our schools, cost those out, identify the strategies for implementation, and then go about the business of displaying all that vividly and then implement it in a positive way. I'm hoping to surround myself with competent people who have those kinds of answers, but I'm also hoping to plug into the competent people around our state who are there willing and waiting to be of assistance to us. Some of these are professional educators, and some of these are lay citizens knowledgeable about education, knowledgeable about what education should require on the part of our students. We have a cadre of people around this state whose expertise has not been tapped, and I want to tap that expertise.
You want them to look to you for leadership, your office.
There's no question in my mind that the State Superintendent of Public Instruction needs to be an educational leader. Now, how that leadership service is to be delivered is where I have to make some decisions in the very near future. I'm hoping that I can provide the kind of leadership that this state requires.
Will there be a difference in the department's role in secondary education or higher education? And would you like to see changes in those roles?
The very first week that I was in office, I invited Clyde Engel, who is the Commissioner of Higher Education, into my office. Clyde and I have now had 4 meetings in the first 10 weeks that I've been in my position. We've also had a joint meeting of his top staff and our top staff looking at this articulation between the 12th grade and the freshman year in college. We know that far too many students are being required to take courses of remediation in college. We need to reduce that number. In fact, the Commission on Higher Education has said that by the year 1992, they're going to be out of the business of remediating college freshmen. We're going to have to do something in our public schools to bring about a program that prepares students for college in a fashion that's better than we're preparing them right now. And part of the reason is, perhaps, that colleges haven't told us what it is they require of entering freshmen.
All right. How about attracting higher quality students to the field?
To the
teaching
field.
Yes.
We have several ways, I think, that can come about. Hopefully, it won't come about because some of the higher quality college students can't find other jobs. That's not a very good reason to come into the profession through the back door. I'm suggesting that we need to make our profession so attractive to these young, bright, aspiring people, responsible people, that they want to enter our profession because they know the personal satisfactions that can be gleaned from participating in the profession of teaching. Some of these satisfactions are monetary, obviously, and we need to look very carefully at the beginning salaries of teachers, which is far too low. The salary is far too low from what it should be. But there are other kinds of things that young people want. They want an environment for working, in our case for teaching, that's commensurate with the needs that they have personally. And we need to look at that very carefully. I've even had a college student say to me, I don't want to go into teaching because if those kids behave the way I behaved when I was in high school, I don't want any part of teaching. So let's face it, we have to look at what kind of discipline we have. Teachers shouldn't be crowd controllers in the classroom. Teachers should be active teaching participants along with the learning student in the classroom.
This remedial problem that the universities complain about, and the legislature wants to eliminate by, is it 1992, you
yes.
said?
The Commission on Higher Education.
Commission on Higher Education
yes,
wants to eliminate, and I think the legislature also has an interest in it,
yes,
too, because of the funding involved.
You bet.
All right. Is it fair to put this problem in the lap of the teacher?
I think it has to be in the lap of society. The problem, as we all know, is not only the problem of the teacher or the administrator or the school itself. I think it's a social problem. I think we have far too many students who are, for example, have been leaving school early in order to go get a job, in order to pay for the gas for their automobile. I think we have far too many students who come home at night, they get in front of the television set, or they are doing non-productive and non-meaningful kinds of activities in the evening. Parents, perhaps, are not assuming the responsibilities of parenthood the way they should. I think it's a social problem and not only a school problem. The problem won't get solved only by the school. The problem can be solved, but it can be solved by the people in our society working together, people who recognize that education is important, who recognize that when a student leaves high school, he or she should be ready for the next rung on the ladder, whatever that might be, whether it's college, whether it's a trade school, whether it's gainful employment, whatever it is, those students need to leave high school prepared for the next rung on the ladder. Public school people aren't going to solve it alone. It's going to be solved ecumenically by everyone.
A shared responsibility.
Must be.
And finally, what is your perception of an outstanding teacher?
I think an outstanding teacher might best be described from a conversation that I had with Ernie Boyer, whom you may know, a former Commissioner of Education, a renowned, well-recognized educator. And I was in conversation with Ernie Boyer about 3 weeks ago, and he said, you know, one night I couldn't sleep. And he said, instead of counting sheep, I counted teachers. I counted 18 of my former teachers, and he said 3 of those teachers I considered as outstanding. The characteristic of those 3 teachers were, 1, the teachers that I counted among the outstanding ones were knowledgeable of their subject. They knew more about their subject than I thought anyone in the world knew about that subject. Secondly, they had the ability to communicate the subject in a meaningful way, a way that I could understand. And thirdly, he said, they were whole people. They were trustworthy, they were honest, they were friendly, they were my friend and my pal as a student. And he said, you know, the first 2 of those you can kind of test. You can give a competency test to teachers and determine whether or not they're knowledgeable and whether or not they can communicate. But you can't test the 3rd one. And you need all 3. A quality teacher must have characteristics that represent all 3 of those components.
Dr. Ruth Howes, professor of physics at Ball State University, recently returned from Washington, D.C., where she served for a year with the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. She served as a consultant, and she'll talk with us about her work with the agency.
Dr. Howes, do you feel that you, as one of the 6 selected from around the nation to serve with the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, made a contribution?
I certainly hope so. It is very hard to judge your own impact on a system. I know that some of the work I did for the agency I personally was very proud of, and I hope that it will have some small impact on the process.
Is it any kind of work that you can talk about, either specifically or generally?
Certainly, yes. I worked in the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, which, as you know, has primary responsibility for backstopping the negotiating teams in Geneva. That is, preparing position papers for them to give and doing basic research on arms control issues. And I worked on the design of treaty provisions which are what we call verifiable, whatever that may mean. It is not entirely clear. And also on looking at some of the technical aspects of our monitoring methods to see how well they'd work in detecting Soviet arms activity, weapon systems activity.
Well, you know, just this week, the President at his news conference mentioned the fact, and he doesn't like the term Star Wars, but he said that the Russians have already tested their own, and of course we must have monitored this somewhere. And also, he said, and I'd like you to comment on both these, please, if you can, that we have made several proposals at the negotiating table that have not been acknowledged. There is no reaction from the Russians whatsoever that we will reduce X number of certain armaments, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, or whatever, and he says we're getting no response from them.
I think that at the present time, the major deadlock in the Geneva negotiations concerns the relationship between offensive weapons and defensive weapons. As you know, this round of the talks was completely restructured from preceding rounds of the talks, including a group on defensive systems. Now, our proposals have so far related strictly to offensive reductions. The Soviets have said that they don't want to talk about offensive weapons reduction unless they're coupled to defensive weapons reduction. So therefore, they have not responded to offers of defensive weapons reduction. On the other hand, we have made no concrete offer, to my knowledge, that we are willing to couple offensive reductions to control of defensive weapon systems.
What is the holdup? Why wouldn't you want to reduce both offensive and defensive weapons?
President Reagan, and I think he made it very clear last night in his press conference, made it very clear that he feels that defensive systems are the key to ending the threat of nuclear war. And for this reason, he has, doesn't wish to trade our potential deployments of defensive weapons systems for reductions in Soviet offensive weapons systems.
Is there, well, then why would a nation fear a defensive system? Can it be turned into an offensive system?
According to the Brookings Institute, the Soviets feel exactly this about SDI. They feel that if we deployed an effective defensive systems against ballistic missiles, or even a partially effective defensive system, this would allow us to launch a massive first strike against Soviet systems and then defend ourselves effectively against the sort of ragged retaliation that they would be able to mount after we had hit them with everything we had the first time around. And they find this very, very threatening. The other thing is that many of the technologies that are used in developing defensive systems can also be used to make offensive weapons systems if one puts one's mind to it. For example, an infrared seeker can be used to destroy an offensive tank. This is not SDI, but it's a reasonable analogy. It can be used to destroy an offensive tank, but it can also be used to destroy a tank that has a defensive position. So they fear that what we are really doing is saying we're building a defensive system, but in fact we're going to field it as an offensive system. Threaten them with a first strike and absorb their retaliation.
Do you think anyone really believes that? either in this country or in that country? Does anyone really believe that?
I'm pretty sure that no one in this country seriously thinks we have any intention of launching a first strike. I wonder what the Soviet man in the street may think. I have no data at all to support what a Soviet citizen might think. Their leadership certainly says this.
What were your views before going to work for the agency last year?
I've believed very strongly in the arms control process since I can remember. I think that the buildup of nuclear arms has put us in the position of two men who have ladders leaning against each other, and I think they have climbed up the ladders, balancing against one another. And so the ladders are leaning against one another. The whole system is momentarily balanced, but if anybody goes up a couple of steps quickly, or even comes down a couple of steps quickly, the entire edifice will topple right over. I think this is an analogy to buildup of weapon systems. We're balanced now, and we need to back down very slowly and very carefully through arms control negotiations.
Did your work with the Disarmament Agency change your views, enhance your views, reinforce them?
Well, I think that it opened my eyes to the complexity of the negotiating process. I hadn't realized quite how strongly treaties are legal documents, how important the wording of the treaty is in terms of whether there's a loophole in the treaty or whether you can enforce the treaty. And I hadn't realized how very, very carefully every statement made by a negotiator has to be prepared. In other words, when our negotiators make an offer at the table, it's not just like you and me going out to lunch and I say, hey, want to get together and make a bargain? It's something that comes from Washington and has been written out and thought out in advance. The only freedom the negotiator has is to change the wording in the way he presents the proposal.
There's no latitude, hardly.
Almost none at all. If the negotiators exceed their instructions, they are called on the carpet, but fast.
I'd like to ask you one final question. You're an advocate for peace. I don't know anyone. I've never talked to anyone who advocates war. And you've worked very closely with the Disarmament Agency. Do you think there's a possibility of our reaching an accord?
In the immediate future, I would be extremely surprised if we were able to conclude a major disarmament agreement. The two sides are very, very far apart. Even if President Reagan and Secretary Gorbachev were able to reach an agreement in principle at the summit, it would still take a year or two to negotiate the details of an arrangement, to just get the definitions right so the loopholes wouldn't be there. So no, I'm not particularly optimistic about any short-term major project.
How about long-term? What are we talking about? 5, 10, 20, 50 years? 1, 2, 3 generations?
I very much hope we're talking about something on the order of 10 years. I think that the interest of the American people and the education of the American people, the way people like the NPOP problem, the Nuclear Policy Options Project here at Ball State are doing, is vital to keeping interest in the process going and to keeping pressure on our leaders to arrive at carefully crafted, rational solutions to these problems.
Goethe von Balmer, Counsel General of the Federal Republic of Germany's Detroit Consulate, spoke at Ball State University's opening of a poster exhibit focusing on composers Johann Sebastian Bach, George Friedrich Handel, and Heinrich Schütz. The Counsel General talked to us about the exhibit and his country in general. Herr Counsel General, is the Masters of German Baroque Music poster exhibit unique?
Yes, it is a special exhibition which had been produced in Germany on account of the tricentennial of the birthday of Bach and Handel and the 400th birthday of Heinrich Schütz. These three composers are very much alive in the music world of both our countries, and we felt it would be of interest to have such an exhibition here in this country, and the response from the American side was very vigorous. It was actually Ball State University which inquired from their side whether they could have the exhibition here. So we were happy to respond and to let them have the exhibition.
What sort of festivals or other arrangements do you have for celebrating this event in Germany?
Well, Bach festivals have taken place in many cities in Germany, as well as in the United States. I know that a great number of festivals have taken here also, and I have participated at several. The interesting feature is that Bach, Handel and Schütz, all three had lived in what is now Eastern Germany, and quite a number of festivals have also taken place in East Germany. They also have made an exhibition which was exhibited in Ohio. I have seen it there.
Is there cooperation between the two Germanys in respect to the festivals and the celebration?
Well, there is quite a lot of cooperation between East and West Germany, and the cultural side perhaps is the easier side. It is not so easy after all, but as far as the Bach Festival is concerned, visitors from West Germany went over to East Germany and vice versa. This is a topic which is comparatively non-political and therefore a bit easier. It was already much more complicated 2 years ago when we had the 500th birthday of Martin Luther. Martin Luther also lived in what is now East Germany, the same area where the three composers lived, and this was of a rather complicated political structure, this Martin Luther 500th birthday, with the question, for instance, whether heads of state and even the West German president would accept an invitation to East Germany. They, in fact, declined. But anyway, from what I say, you may gather that this had been a question which went high up to the political level.
How is the religious institutions in East Germany? We don't want to get into the political aspects, but if they were celebrating Luther's birthday, how strong are they?
Well, as far as I know, and I can't speak for East Germany, of course, but as far as I know, Martin Luther's birthday was celebrated and acknowledged by the state authorities also. The freedom of the church is pretty limited in East Germany, but the government took Martin Luther's birthday as a political event also and participated in official functions.
We keep reading in the American press where the two Germanys appear to be moving closer together in trade and cultural relations.
Yes, in a number of questions there is cooperation, and to some extent there is also a positive cooperation. For instance, in the vital question of environmental protection. Environmental pollution, air and water pollution doesn't stop at the border, so cooperation is advisable in these things.